The mountainside came apart with a sound like the sky itself tearing, and Josephine Earl, 24 years old, had time to do exactly one thing before the slope above the trail let go entirely, which was to throw herself sideways into a shallow cleft of standing rock, while a wall of loosened stone and uprooted brush roared past, close enough to fill her mouth and eyes with grit and dust, burying the trail behind her under 10 feet of rubble in the space of a few violent seconds. She lay pressed flat against cold stone, with her ears ringing and her whole body shaking. One hand still locked, white-knuckled around the strap of a canvas satchel holding $13, her father's specimen knife, and a small case of glass eyes wrapped in cotton wadding. And it was only when the roar finally settled into an ordinary, terrible silence that she understood the slide had done what an hour of running from the man behind her had not quite managed, which was to seal her into a narrow crack in the rock with no way forward and, as far as she could tell in the settling dust, no way back either. She had left Cedar Hollow before dawn to be gone before anyone thought to stop her, carrying nothing of her father's life's work, but the tools that had been hers to begin with, because a lawyer acting for a distant institution had explained to her 3 weeks earlier, in a voice entirely without malice, that the rest of it, every specimen, every case, every stone her father had ever labeled in his own careful hand, now belonged to men she had never met. She did not know, working her way deeper into the cleft by feel in the pitch dark, because the alternative was to sit still and wait for either the man who had followed her or her own fear to finish what the mountain had started, that the crack in the rock she was following had been widened, deliberately, by human hands, a very long time ago, and that it led somewhere a solitary man had once built a life out of exactly the kind of patient, careful cataloging her father had taught her to love. Settle in with us tonight, and before we go any further, tap that subscribe button and tell us down in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because what Josephine Earl found on the other side of that rock slide was about to become the finest natural history collection in the territory, and the story of how she got there starts a long time before the mountain came down, and a long way from where it ends. Cedar Hollow sat in a fold of the high country where the timber gave way, a little above the town itself, to bare rock and thin mountain air, and it had drawn, almost from its founding, a certain kind of person curious about what the ground itself might have to say, and none more than Thaddeus Earl, who arrived in the valley in the year Josephine was born with a wagon of glass cases, a set of surveying instruments, and a restless, exacting mind that had never once been satisfied with simply admiring a thing when it might instead be measured, labeled, and understood. He built, over 2 decades, a modest but genuinely respected collection, birds and small mammals mounted with a taxidermist's careful hand, mineral specimens gathered from every drainage within 30 miles, pressed botanical sheets, fossils worked loose from shale beds along the ridge, all of it housed in a long front room attached to the family's small house, which the town came to call, half in affection and half in genuine curiosity, the cabinet, and which brought a slow but steady trade in specimen sales to collectors and university men back east, who wrote letters full of Latin names and modest sums of money. Josephine's mother died of a lung fever when Josephine was 7, and Thaddeus Earl, left alone with a small daughter and a collection that demanded as much patience as any child, simply folded the two together, raising Josephine in the cabinet itself, teaching her almost from the time she could hold a tool at all the careful, unhurried craft that had become his whole life. He taught her to skin a small mammal without tearing the hide, working the blade close along the muscle with a patience that could not be rushed without ruining a specimen beyond repair. He taught her to set glass eyes true and level, so a mounted bird looked out at the world rather than simply staring, and to pack a fragile skin in cedar shavings and paper against the damp for a journey east. He taught her to label every specimen in a small, exact hand, with the date, the place, and the collector's name, because a specimen without its record, he told her, was worth almost nothing to anyone. A curiosity rather than knowledge. He taught her to grind and polish a mineral sample, to press a botanical sheet flat and dry without losing its color, and to keep the cabinet's ledger of sales and correspondence in a hand steady enough that a university curator 2,000 miles away could read her figures without writing back to ask her to repeat them. Nothing in Thaddeus Earl's cabinet was ever simply displayed. Everything had to be earned through patient, careful attention, and Josephine grew into a young woman who understood the world that way without ever having been told to. In the 11th year of the cabinet's existence, Thaddeus Earl, wanting to fund a full-season survey expedition into a range of unmapped country to the north that he believed held specimens no Eastern collection yet possessed, entered into a written agreement with an institution calling itself the Blackwell Foundation for Natural History, based in a city Josephine had never seen, by which the foundation advanced him $300 against the promise that, upon the completion of a comprehensive survey collection of the Northern Range, ownership of that collection, and, in language Thaddeus had read too quickly and too hopefully to properly weigh, of the building and grounds housing his existing collection as well, would transfer to the foundation in trust for the advancement of natural knowledge. Thaddeus completed perhaps 2/3 of the survey before his health began to fail him. In the winter of Josephine's 22nd year, the same slow tightening in the chest that mountain men who had spent a lifetime handling arsenic-treated hides and grinding mineral dust so often carried into their final years, and he worked less and sat longer among his own cases, and would sometimes hold a small unlabeled stone in his hand without working it at all, running his thumb along its cool surface, the way a man runs his thumb along the edge of a thing he is trying to memorize before it is taken from him. He did not speak of the Blackwell Agreement in those months, believing, in the plain, unsuspicious way of a man who trusted the written word more than he perhaps ought to have, that an incomplete survey simply meant an incomplete transfer, and not the whole forfeiture the document's careful language actually described. By the first snow of the following autumn, Thaddeus Earl was gone, buried on the low rise above the cabinet where the first light of morning fell longest, and Josephine sat alone among her father's cases with a stillness in her chest that she had learned from him and did not intend to break. The letter from the Blackwell Foundation arrived 6 weeks after the funeral, written in a clerk's careful copying hand on behalf of a Mr. Aldous Pratt, the Foundation's collections agent, informing Josephine Earl that under the plain terms of the advance agreement her father had signed, the incomplete state of the Northern Survey at the time of his death constituted a default of the agreement's conditions, and that the default, per a clause Josephine had somehow never once heard her father mention, entitled the Foundation not merely to recover its original advance, but to claim, in lieu of cash repayment her father's estate plainly could not provide, the whole of the existing cabinet collection and the building that housed it as the nearest equivalent security named anywhere in the document. Josephine rode 2 days to the county seat and sat across a desk from a circuit judge who read the agreement twice, slowly, and told her, not unkindly, that the language was inartful and perhaps unfair, but that it was also unambiguous, and that a contract a man had signed with his own hand bound his estate, whether or not, in hindsight, he ought to have read it more carefully. Mr. Aldous Pratt himself came to Cedar Hollow to oversee the matter, a precise, correct man of perhaps 50, who spoke in the flat, unhurried voice of a man accustomed to explaining unwelcome terms, without ever once raising it, and who told Josephine, standing in the cabinet among specimens her father had spent 20 years assembling, that the Foundation took no particular pleasure in the matter, that the collection would be crated and shipped east where it could serve, he said, the broader advancement of science, rather than sitting in a private cabinet in a mountain town few scholars would ever visit, and that she would be allowed 30 days to remove whatever personal effects were not, by the strict terms of the agreement, part of the collection proper. He did not ask what she intended to do. He did not ask where a woman of 24, with no other kin and no other trade, might go. He simply consulted a printed inventory list, checked off item by item what belonged to the estate and what belonged, narrowly, to her, and told her, in the manner of a man who has done nothing wrong because every step he took was written down somewhere first, that her father's own specimen tools, having no scientific value beyond their use, were hers to keep. Josephine spent the 30 days doing what needed doing, whether or not she had a home at the end of them. She finished labeling the last uncatalogued drawer of mineral samples, because a specimen without its record was worth nothing to anyone, and she found she could not make herself leave the work half done on principle. She wrote, from memory, a careful copy of her father's field notes into a private notebook of her own, before the originals were crated away with everything else, and on the morning of the 30th day she packed a canvas satchel with her father's skinning knife, his forceps and specimen pins, a small case of glass eyes he had never gotten to use, 2 changes of clothes, her copied notebook, and $13 folded into a handkerchief, which was the whole of the cash Thaddeus Earl had kept apart from the cabinet's accounts. And she walked out past the crated cases, stacked and waiting for a freight wagon, without looking back at the room where she had learned, one careful label at a time, everything she understood about paying close attention to the world. She took a room above the apothecary in the small, clustered center of Cedar Hollow, paying by the week for washing dishes at the Miners' Rest, the town's one boarding house, and she listened, the way a person with nothing else to spend listens, because listening cost nothing at all. It was in the boarding house kitchen, drying a stack of tin plates past 9 at night, that she heard old Ambrose Teal, 70 years old, the valley's unofficial historian, and a man who remembered every claim and every death for 30 miles, speak of Raven's Shelf, high in the rim rock above the North Fork, where a former Army surveyor named Augustin Fell had built a field station into the mouth of a natural rock overhang and lived there alone for 19 years, cataloging the geology and wildlife of the high country with a rigor that had once earned him letters from scientific men back east, far more prominent than any correspondent of her father's, and who had been found dead in his own station one autumn morning by a boy sent up with mail, gone quietly of some failure of the heart, and whose station and its ground had reverted to the county unclaimed since, because the approach to the shelf ran along a slope prone to slides in wet weather, and no one had thought a solitary old surveyor's rock station worth the risk. Josephine asked where. Ambrose Teal, surprised that anyone still cared, told her, and drew the way on the back of a feed receipt with a stub of pencil, up along the North Fork Trail past the old assay cabin, along a bench below the rimrock, to a natural shelf of stone that caught the morning sun, and had, he said, likely been chosen for exactly that reason, dry and defensible and impossible to miss once a person knew where to look. He was not the only man in the kitchen listening. A boarder named Garrett Coyle, 38 years old, who had drifted into Cedar Hollow claiming to work for a rival Eastern collector, and had spent most of a week asking careful questions about what specimens the Earl cabinet had contained before it was crated away, leaned across the table afterward and told Josephine, in a voice pitched low but not low enough, that an old surveyor's mineral collection sitting unclaimed for 20 years in wild country was not the sort of prize a woman traveling alone had any business going after first, particularly not a woman who might, he suggested, already know a good deal more about where valuable specimens tended to hide than she was letting on. She did not answer him. She had learned, from a collections agent who never once raised his voice, exactly how little a woman's answer weighed against a man who had already decided what he meant to take. She thanked Ambrose Teal, said nothing more to Garrett Coyle, and went up to her room and did not sleep. And in the black hour before the boarding house woke, she took her satchel, her father's tools, and her $13, and let herself out through the kitchen door into a morning heavy with cloud and the particular damp stillness that comes before mountain rock, saturated by days of rain, begins to move. She was perhaps 2 miles up the North Fork Trail, the bench below the rimrock still a mile or more ahead of her, when she heard, behind her on the trail, boots moving too fast to be casual, and turned to see Garrett Coyle closing the distance with the loose, purposeful walk of a man who no longer saw much reason to hide his intentions. He did not call out to her the way a man calls out to someone he means to speak with plainly. He simply came on, and Josephine, understanding in that instant exactly what a man who suspected her of hiding valuable knowledge might be prepared to do to extract it from her in country this empty, left the trail and climbed instead, cutting up through loose scree toward the rimrock itself, reasoning, in the scattered way a person reasons when they are frightened. That broken ground would slow a man in boots better suited to a boarding house floor than a mountainside. The rain that had been threatening all morning began in earnest as she climbed, and the ground beneath her, already saturated from days of steady weather, began to shift and slide with every third or fourth step, small runs of loosened gravel hissing away downslope ahead of her. Garrett Coyle's voice rose behind her now, no longer bothering with any pretense of patience, and Josephine climbed harder, her breath tearing, her satchel strap cutting into her shoulder, until she felt, rather than heard at first, a deep shifting groan pass through the ground itself, the particular sound of an entire saturated slope losing its grip on the mountain beneath it, and she threw herself sideways into the nearest fold of standing rock as the slope above the trail let go entirely, a wall of stone and root and mud thundering past close enough to fill her mouth with grit, burying the trail she had just left, and Garrett Coyle's voice, somewhere behind and below her in the chaos, cutting off entirely, whether from distance or from something worse, she did not stay to learn. When the roar finally settled into an ordinary, terrible silence, Josephine found herself pressed into a narrow cleft of rock with rubble packed solid behind her, and no way to know, in the settling dust and rain, whether the trail ahead had fared any better than the trail behind. She worked her way forward by feel, deeper into what she slowly understood was not simply a crack in the rock but a widened passage, its walls too regular to be entirely natural, and after what felt like a very long time crawling through absolute darkness with her father's tools clutched against her chest, she felt the passage open around her, and her outstretched hand, instead of finding more stone, found the smooth-worked edge of a timber doorframe. The door itself, when she found it, hung slightly ajar on iron hinges, and she pushed through into a space that smelled of old paper, mineral dust, and dry cedar, and stood a long moment in the pitch dark, simply breathing, until her shaking hands found, on a shelf just inside the door, exactly where a careful man would have kept it against precisely this kind of emergency, a tin of matches and a stub of candle, and she lit it with fingers that would barely hold the striker steady. The small warm circle of candlelight showed her a room built into the rock overhang itself, one wall of natural stone, the others of squared timber, a narrow cot along one side, a stone hearth with its flue cut cleverly up through a natural fissure in the rock above, and along the far wall, a long specimen table scarred deep with the marks of careful, repeated work, hundreds of small, precise cuts and grinding marks worn pale into the wood, the unmistakable signature of a man who had spent his solitary evenings at the one craft that had kept him whole. Shelves above the table still held rows of labeled mineral samples and a scatter of fossil fragments, dust-furred but otherwise exactly as their collector had left them. Josephine sat with her back against the closed door a long while, listening for any sound of garret coil beyond the sealed passage, and hearing nothing but the settling patter of rain on stone somewhere above her. And slowly, as her heartbeat found its ordinary rhythm again, she understood that, whatever had chased her up that slope, the man and the mountain both had for now been left entirely behind her. In the morning, with gray light filtering in through a second, smaller opening she had not found the night before, a narrow natural chimney of rock that let in both air and a thin shaft of daylight, Josephine explored the rest of the station and found it modest but whole. A second small room for storage, a rain catchment cut cleverly into the rock outside, and, working loose a warped board at the base of the specimen table where mice had chewed a nest, a shallow dug cavity beneath it lined with flat stones, the kind of careful, patient masonry a solitary man builds slowly in the evenings, over more than one season. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, gone stiff and dark, was a tin document box, the hasp rusted but not seized, and inside the box, a canvas pouch heavy with coin, a folded packet of paper currency gone soft at the creases, and beneath both, a letter written in a plain, careful, unhurried hand that had clearly practiced its letters the same patient way it had practiced its surveying and its cataloging both. The letter was dated the autumn of 1868, and it began, "To whoever finds this ground worth keeping. My name is Augustin Fell, and I have kept this station alone for 19 years, having served as an army surveyor in my younger years and having lost, in the same campaign that taught me to read a landscape properly, both my closest friend and any real wish to live among other men afterward. I came to this shelf in the spring after my discharge with a mule, a set of instruments, and no clear notion of what I meant to do beyond simply looking closely at ground. Most men rode past without a second glance, and I have sold mineral and fossil specimens to collectors and universities in the East every season since, and never once found a use for the money beyond what fed and clothed me. So it is gathered here, under this table, a little at a time, against whatever day I judged I might need it, and never quite did. I am 58 years old as I write this, and my heart has begun to trouble me in a small, quiet way. I do not think will trouble me much longer, and I have no kin living that I know of, and I find I do not mind that half so much as I once thought I would. Whoever finds this box has found it because they came further into this mountain than most people are willing to come, and I have come to believe, cataloging this ground alone for 19 years, that a place worth understanding calls back the people patient enough to look closely at it. Take what is here. Keep the collection if you have the temperament for it, and if you do not, at least be kind enough to see it into hands that will. I hope you are that someone, and I hope you are patient, and I hope somebody loves you well enough to notice when you have done a good day's careful work. Augustin Fell, written this 2nd of October. Josephine sat with the letter in her lap until the candle had burned low, and then she counted what the box held by its small light at the specimen table, the way her father had taught her to count anything that mattered, twice and out loud, so the numbers would hold still. There were $231 in coin and paper both, more cash money than Josephine Earl had ever held at once in her life, more than her father's whole cabinet had turned in a good year. She did not spend a dollar of it that first week. She set the box back beneath the table, replaced the board, and began instead the only kind of work she trusted completely, which was the work of her own 2 hands. She spent that first fortnight simply looking, cataloging what Augustin Fell had left behind with the same careful discipline her father had taught her, clearing the entrance passage of the last loose rubble from the slide so the station could be reached without her own body, serving as the only proof a way through existed, and rebuilding, stone by stone, the rain catchment that had partly collapsed in some winter long past. She reset the door on its old iron hinges, cleaned and oiled against further rust, and she began, in the patient order Thaddeus Earl had drilled into her since before she could properly hold a specimen knife, to bring Raven's shelf back from the edge it had been standing on for 20 years. Word that a young woman was living alone at the old Fell station traveled the way word travels along a mountain trail, slowly at first, and then all at once. And by the end of her first month, Josephine had visitors. Ambrose Teal himself climbed the North Fork Trail on a Sunday afternoon, leaning on a hickory stick, 70 years old, and proud of every step, and stood in the station a long while before he said that he had known Augustine Fell slightly in his younger years, and that the old surveyor had once told him a specimen properly labeled would outlast the man who found it and the ground it came from both. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Garrett Coyle had been found 2 days after the slide, badly shaken and with a broken arm, having been caught at the very edge of the slide's path and thrown clear rather than buried, and that the sheriff, looking into his claimed employment, had found no rival collector in the East who had ever heard his name, and had run him out of the county on a vagrancy charge as soon as his arm allowed him to ride. He said it the way he said most things, as a plain fact of the valley's slow bookkeeping, and Josephine found she did not need to hear anything more about the man than that. Cornelius Aldrich, 45 years old, the Cedar Hollow blacksmith, rode up with a set of forged tools better suited to careful specimen work than anything she had carried up in her satchel, and spent an afternoon showing her how to use them, refusing payment beyond a cup of coffee, saying only that Thaddeus Earl had once identified a strange gray stone from his own claim for nothing, and told him plainly it was worthless, saving him a wasted season chasing it, and the account had been open a long time. Beatrice Loomis, 54, who kept the apothecary in Cedar Hollow, sent up a parcel of preserving chemicals and clean cotton wadding by way of a freighter, with a note in careful round writing that said only, "Your father identified the poison that nearly took my husband before any doctor in 3 counties could name it." A widow named Sarah Fell, no relation despite the shared name, 60 years old, who lived at the foot of the North Fork Trail and had buried a husband and a son on the same mountain, began leaving a basket of dried apples on the flat stone at the base of the trail every second Sunday, never climbing up herself, never asking to be thanked, simply leaving the basket and walking home. It was in the second spring, on a clear morning, with the last snow just retreating up the highest ridges, that Ezekiel Combs rode up the North Fork Trail on a sturdy mule loaded with sample bags and a small set of assay tools. A traveling geologist and mineral trader of 32 years, who worked a circuit through the high country each season, buying and identifying mineral specimens for collectors and mining concerns both, and who had heard from Cornelius Aldrich at the smithy 2 days before that a young woman was trying to bring back Augustine Fell's old station alone. He came up expecting, he admitted to her plainly, and without apology months later, to find an amateur's jumble of unsorted stones and more enthusiasm than method. And he found instead a woman cataloging a fresh mineral find with a rigor so exact that he sat his mule at the edge of the shelf a full minute before she noticed him, simply watching the careful, unhurried way she recorded each sample's precise location before ever touching it. He did not offer to take over. That was the thing Josephine noticed first and remembered longest, that Ezekiel Combs, unlike every other man who had crossed her path since Aldous Pratt checked items off a printed list, did not reach for the specimen in her hands or suggest she might do better to let him identify it for her. He asked instead how long she had studied minerals, and when she told him her father's name, he said he had bought and traded samples from collectors as far as 2 counties over who spoke well of Earl cabinet specimens for as long as he had worked his circuit, and that he could see now where the rigor had come from. He stayed that first visit 2 days, not because she asked him to, but because he had, he said, a set of unusual samples in his load he could not properly place, and hated to sell on, without a second careful opinion, and he worked alongside her at the specimen table each morning, cross-referencing his samples against her father's old field notes. And on the second evening, before he rode on, he showed her a technique for testing a mineral's hardness against a known scale, using nothing but a set of common tools, a technique her father had never quite formalized for her. Not because Thaddeus had not known it, she suspected, but because he had never needed to teach it so precisely, and she practiced it that same evening under Ezekiel Combs's quiet correction until the method settled into her hands on its own. He came back that autumn, when his circuit brought him north again for the fall trading season, and stayed 3 days helping her properly catalog and pack a backlog of Augustin Fell's own unfinished specimens for sale. And he came back the following spring with a fresh set of samples gathered from a range she had never visited herself, and by the second year, his spring and autumn visits to Raven's Shelf had become simply part of the shape of the season, the way the spring thaw and the first hard frost were part of the shape of the season, expected and depended upon, without either of them naming it as anything more than good sense between two people who understood the same patient, exacting discipline. He never once suggested she could not manage the collection alone. He never once offered to buy in, or take a share, or set his name beside hers on any paper. What he offered each visit was work, freely given and precisely matched to what the season needed. And Josephine found, somewhere in the third year, that she had begun listening for the sound of his mule on the North Fork Trail, the way she listened for the first true thaw, with a kind of patient, unhurried attention that she did not examine too closely, because examining it too closely felt, to her, like the sort of thing that could compromise a careful observation before it had properly settled into fact. In her first autumn at Raven's Shelf, Josephine walked down into Cedar Hollow with $4 of Augustin Fell's money in her coat pocket and filed, at the small land office kept by a clerk named Horace Quill, 37 years old, in sleeve garters and spectacles, a homestead claim on the shelf and the rimrock ground above it, the ground having reverted to the county's unclaimed rolls a full 20 years before and never entered by anyone in the interval. Horace Quill asked no questions beyond what the law required, wrote out the paperwork in a careful clerk's hand, and told her, as he stamped the receipt, that a proving period stood between her and a clear patent, but that continuous residence and improvement, which she had plainly already begun, would satisfy it without difficulty. She paid the filing fee from Augustin Fell's coin and walked back up the trail with the receipt folded inside her copied field notebook, beside the letter that had brought her there. The proving years passed, the way seasons pass when a person has real work to fill them. She rebuilt the station's small storage room into a proper specimen workshop, restocked its shelves with new tools, bought a piece at a time, as her own earnings allowed, and began building, specimen by careful specimen, a new collection of her own alongside Augustin Fell's old one, corresponding with the same university men who had once written to her father, sending careful, exact letters full of Latin names and precise field notes that earned, within a few seasons, a small but genuine reputation of her own. By the third autumn, correspondents as far as the eastern seaboard were asking after Raven's Shelf specimens by name, and a freighter named Otis Vale, 29, who charged her half what he charged a stranger, because his own father had once been treated for a fever with a remedy Thaddeus Earl had identified from a mountain plant and refused payment for, hauled her crated shipments down to the depot twice a season without ever once being asked twice. Word of what she had built reached the Blackwell Foundation, the way most news of a small mountain collection eventually reached a distant institution, slowly, second-hand, and stripped of anything but the bare facts that the daughter whose father's collection they had claimed was, it seemed, building a new and genuinely respected collection of her own from an abandoned survey station above Cedar Hollow. Mr. Aldous Pratt did not travel out to see it himself. A junior clerk at the foundation mentioned once, in the course of an unrelated piece of correspondence, that the crated Earl collection had arrived east in poor condition after a rough freight journey, several of the finer mounted specimens damaged beyond repair, and that the foundation, having no naturalist on staff, with her father's particular skill for identification, had found the collection, once unpacked, considerably less valuable without its careful labeling and provenance than it had appeared sitting whole in its own cabinet, so that the whole costly effort of claiming it had yielded, in the end, considerably less than the $300 originally advanced. Josephine heard this from Ambrose Teal on one of his Sunday visits, delivered without malice, simply as news, and she found, turning it over in her mind that evening while she labeled a fresh mineral sample, that she felt very little about it at all, the way a person feels very little about weather that has already passed. The foundation had believed, in claiming the cabinet, that it was collecting what a contract plainly owed it. It had not understood that a collection's true value lay in the patient hand that catalogued it, and that hand, and the knowledge it carried, had walked out the door with Josephine Earl, and could not be crated or shipped anywhere at all. In the 5th spring, with the proving period satisfied and the station producing a full season's specimens for the first time since Augustin Fell's death, Horace Quill rode up the North Fork Trail himself, an unusual courtesy for a land office clerk, carrying the patent in a leather case, signed and sealed and stamped with the territorial seal, and he sat at the specimen table Augustin Fell had built and examined a tray of Josephine's own careful mounts while she finished a label beside him and told her, in the plain, unhurried way of a man delivering good news he had waited a long time to deliver, that the ground was hers, now beyond any question a court could raise, hers and no one else's, in a manner no distant foundation and no inartfully worded contract could ever again disturb. She signed the receipt of delivery in the same steady hand that had once made a circuit judge's own clerk look twice, and Horace Quill rode back down the trail before dark, and Josephine sat alone that evening on the station step with a patent in her lap and watched the light go long and gold across ground that had, 5 years before, been nothing but a sealed rock slide and a dead man's forgotten shelves. It was on an evening very like that one, in the early autumn of the 6th year, with the season's specimens mostly catalogued and packed, and the first hard frost still a week or two off, that Ezekiel Combs rode up the trail later than his usual visits and later than the daylight, and found Josephine on the station step with a lantern already lit beside her. And he told her, without much preamble, in the same plain voice he had once used to explain a hardness scale, that he had been offered a settled position assaying for a mining concern, 2 valleys south, a fixed thing, a proper office, and no more riding circuit from one claim to the next, and that he had turned it down that very morning without regretting it for 1 hour since, because he had found, somewhere in 6 years of spring and autumn visits, that the only ground he wanted to keep coming back to was this one. He did not ask her anything that evening. He simply told her, and let the telling sit between them, the way an unlabeled specimen sits waiting on a table for a day or two before anyone is entirely certain what they have found. Josephine did not answer him that night either, not in words. But the following spring, when his mule came up the North Fork Trail earlier than the season strictly called for, she was already standing at the entrance to meet him before he was within hailing distance. And she did not pretend she had not been listening for the sound of him, and that, between two people who had spent 6 years, speaking mostly through the careful language of mineral samples and field notes, and shared work at the same table, was answer enough for either of them. By the 8th year, Raven's Shelf, as it was still called by everyone in the valley, though no one any longer thought of it as abandoned, supplied specimens and careful identification to collectors and institutions as far as the eastern seaboard, kept a standing correspondence with 3 universities and a growing number of private collectors besides, and stood. Alongside a small assay office, Ezekiel Combs ran from a rebuilt room at the station's entrance. As the settled joint work of 2 people who had each spent a working lifetime learning that nothing worth understanding was ever simply given, and that knowledge, however small its beginnings, could be built patient and exact into something that outlasted any single contract or claim if it was never once rushed. The old Earl cabinet in Cedar Hollow itself stood empty now, its shelves bare. Its front room let out to a dry goods merchant who had no particular interest in what had once filled it, remembered by no one but Ambrose Teal, who mentioned it sometimes on his Sunday visits, the way a man mentions a fact of history rather than a wound, and Josephine found she could hear the name Blackwell now, without any particular weight attaching to it at all, the way a person hears the name of a landslide that came down in some other valley a long time ago, and left nothing behind but a story. On a clear evening in the 9th autumn, Josephine stood at the entrance to the station with a freshly labeled mineral tray in her hands, and looked back at the shelves rebuilt and full behind her, at the assay office below with its lamp already lit against the coming dark, at specimens arranged in careful, patient order in every direction, a collection built 100 times over from the same discipline. A solitary surveyor had first practiced on this ground 20 years before her, asking for nothing in return but that whoever found his letter be patient and kind and loved by someone who noticed a good day's careful work. She thought of her father teaching her to set glass eyes, true and level, so a mounted bird looked out at the world rather than simply staring. She thought of Augustin Fell practicing the same careful cataloging 10,000 times alone at a table, worn pale with the marks of his own patience, trusting, in the last years of his life, that someone willing to come far enough into the mountain would deserve what waited at the end of the passage. And she thought of Ezekiel Combs's mule coming up the North Fork Trail each spring before the season strictly called for it, and she understood, standing there with the tray steady in her hands and the light going long and gold across the shelf, that everything she had ever been given had come to her the same way a mountain gives up its secrets to anyone patient enough to look closely, not all at once, and not without careful attention, but specimen by specimen, exact and unhurried and bound, in the end, to be understood. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I told it, take a moment now to subscribe and to share it with someone who has ever been told, by a paper they signed too quickly, or a man who never once raised his voice, that a thing they built with their own patient hands no longer belonged to them. Leave a word in the comments and let us know where you're watching from tonight, and tell us about the person in your own life who taught you to look closely at the world instead of simply passing it by, the one who showed you, in small and patient ways, that nothing worth knowing is ever simply given. It has to be studied and earned and proven, one careful observation at a time. And ask yourself, too, before you close the window and go on with your evening, about the quieter question underneath that one, whether there is someone in your life who has kept coming back to you, season after season, without ever asking for more than the chance to help with whatever the next careful piece of work needed. Someone who waited, patient as an unlabeled specimen waiting to be properly understood, for you to notice that he had already decided, a long time before you had, exactly which ground he meant to keep.